to our webinar exploring the real rules. My name is Mike Pissarro. I am the Policy Director of the Watershed Institute. Thank you for joining us this evening for this joint venture, this co-hosted webinar with American Littoral Society and NJPACT and the Pinelands Preservation Alliance. We're going to give it just another minute or two, allow people to trickle in. So we'll give it a start in a minute, but we appreciate you giving us your Monday evening to learn about these very important and expansive rules. And we're just going to give it a couple minutes as people trickle in. Hopefully everyone made it home and had some dinner. All right. All right. Because I don't like silence. Good evening again. Welcome to Exploring the Real Rules webinar on the New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats, Resilient Environments and Landscapes rule came out on August 5th. All right. I think we have somewhat of a critical mass and we're going to get started. So some logistics, everyone will ask. Yes, we are recording this. Yes, we will share the recording, including the slides. If you have a question, Zoom has the ability for the question and answer. We will be monitoring the question and answer chat or question and answer feature, but we will keep most of the questions to the end unless I see something in there that just begs us to stop and answer that question. And again, thank you for participating in our webinar this evening. All right. This evening, this webinar is brought to you by your favorite letters, ALS, NJPACT, PPA, and TWI. Now, we are very grateful for having the expertise and time of the American Littoral Society, Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions, Pinelands Preservation Alliance, and the Watershed Institute here. I'm not going to read everyone's bios because you can read, but Jennifer Coffey will be talking this evening. Myself, Tim Dillingham from American Littoral Society, and Lucia Osborne from also the American Littoral Society. So with that, there's your agenda. We're going to go over the science of NJPACT because that sort of underpins why we are doing what we are doing, or DEP's doing it. Oh, sorry. I had too much caffeine. We're going to go over an overview of the rules. There's a lot of misinformation going out there. So we're going to try to address some of that and then go through a question and answer. I will preface this. This was a 1,000-page rule release when DEP put a courtesy copy. If you pulled it out of the NJ register, it's a little over 400 pages of really, really tiny print. But there's a lot in there. And we're going to try to get some of the top level, some of the biggest issues, but there is just a lot of changes, a lot of information in there. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jen to talk about the science.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm going to take the science baton tonight. And if you print these regulations out in font that normal people can read, I've got 3 binders worth that I am constantly going through and flipping back and forth on. So there's a lot in these 1,044 pages using normal type font. And we are going to do our best to give you some of the background here and also to provide some details and highlights of what we think are the most important in these regulations. We are very excited about these regulations because they are the first, combined with the flood hazard regs, which were part of the NJPACT that were introduced last year. They are the first set of regulations in the country that use climate modeling to adjust our land use planning and our regulations. And this is big because we know that the past is no longer a predictor of the future when it comes to weather patterns, because climate change is rapidly changing our environment. And because of the science that has been done on this, we now have a high degree of certainty and understanding of what those impacts are going to be here in New Jersey, and can adjust our regulations and planning moving forward. So that's what we're doing here in these NJPACT rules. So NJPACT is New Jersey protecting against climate threats. Real is resilient environment and landscapes. So we talk about, let's get real about climate change and protect against climate threats. So why do I have a picture of snow? One, I like snow and I'm crossing my fingers and hoping we get some this winter. It's been a few years. We do occasionally get here in New Jersey a weather forecast where they talk about the polar vortex or an Arctic blast. And this feels a little unusual in New Jersey. We didn't have these terms when I was growing up. We weren't experiencing this. And that's because the prevailing Arctic winds, which generally stayed up in the Arctic, are starting to collapse. So that system is starting to fail. And that's because of climate change. We're seeing a warming of our environment, and we get dips down in weather patterns, and New Jersey will receive some Arctic blasts or a polar vortex for a few days at a time. Let's go to the next slide. What we're also seeing is the Gulf Stream, which has a major influence on weather on the east coast of the United States, the UK, and much of Western Europe, is another global system that's starting to collapse. So between the prevailing Arctic winds and the Gulf Stream starting to collapse, we are seeing major impacts on weather, precipitation, habitat, migration patterns. So lots of things are shifting, and scientists are doing yeoman's work to understand the impact. I was just turned on the news briefly before coming onto this webinar and saw a meteorologist down in the Gulf talking about how the Gulf is 5 degrees warmer. The Gulf waters are 5 degrees warmer today. Oops, I accidentally muted myself. So the Gulf is 5 degrees warmer today than it should be. So we're seeing this happen throughout our planet. Next slide. And so what these regulations are based on is really the observations as well as the predictions of the science that we're seeing moving forward. This is Rutgers work. So we have a state climatologist, Dr. David Robinson, and his team have a fantastic website. They update it regularly. And what you'll see here is that New Jersey's temperatures are getting warmer. And if you expand out this graph on the left and look at it for several years in a row, what you'll see is lots more red than blue. That's because we are getting warmer and we are having less cold winters. And in fact, when you look at the warming rate, our winters are getting warmer at a faster rate than our summers are getting. So as uncomfortable and quite frankly miserable as I was in July this year, we are seeing our winters get even warmer. So if you think back, we have not had big snowstorms in the past few years. We just don't get long periods of cold, and that has implications for agriculture, for the health of our forest. I know some people appreciate the warmer winters, but it does have some very significant impacts. And the graph on the right is from 1880, about when we started keeping track of temperatures. And you're seeing that it goes pretty much like a staircase up until 2020. So global temperatures are increasing. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Next slide. And so, yeah, okay, we're getting uncomfortable. It's getting warm. What does that do to water? Well, warmer air holds more precipitation. It holds more humidity. And so what we start to see then are larger storms in terms of these flash thunderstorms, larger storms in terms of seeing 4, 5, 7, 8, 9 inches of rain dropping in 2, 3, 4 hours. So receiving a quarter of our annual rainfall in less than a day. And so we're getting these large volumes, we're getting flash flooding. We know what this is like. If we were in a room together, I'd say, raise your hand if you were ever stuck in a flood in New Jersey or affected by a flood, and everybody's hand would go up at some point. I've done it for 10 years. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more water, except for when we don't have enough of it and we've got longer periods of dryness in between, but that's a separate webinar that we'll come back and do. We'll go to the next slide. And so what we are seeing now, or what we're using in these NJPACT, New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threat, Resilient Environments and Landscapes, we want to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change, is science-based policy. So we are using, New Jersey is using NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, Atlas 14, that's the model, precipitation model, to understand what the prevailing Arctic winds that are starting to collapse and what the collapsing Gulf Stream is doing to our weather patterns, and specifically here in New Jersey. And so we can adjust our precipitation as well as our understanding of rising sea levels. So with melting Arctic ice and a warming overall planet, what is happening to us in New Jersey and how can we better protect ourselves? We have compounding factors here in New Jersey because we have some very old development. If you think about our history, we're one of the 13 original colonies. We have very old development. And we have patterns of development that made a whole lot of sense for us as we were developing as a society to be closest to the waterways, for transportation, for commerce. Now that is proving a real threat to our communities, our businesses, our residences, with these expanding floodplains and expanding sea level rise. So the amazing people at Rutgers, including the state climatology division, have taken this data from NOAA Atlas 14 modeling and looked at from the year 2020 through to the year 2100 and have modeled what the heck is going to happen here in New Jersey so that we can build smart policy. And that's what these NJPACT policies are. Next slide. These NJPACT real policies based on the NOAA Atlas 14 data take into account the scenario of having moderate emissions. Now, what does that mean? Hang with me for a second here. This means that not only are we going to work at becoming more resilient to how we develop and where we're developing as a society, and we're going to get into that in a bit, but we have to also do our job to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so the increasing sea level rise in these regulations, as were the precipitation volumes in the previous NJPACT rules that were adopted last July, are based on moderate emission scenarios. So it means we will have, by the year 2100, reduced our greenhouse gas emissions below what they are today. So we are saying we have got to do our job in reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. If we do not, then things will be absolutely worse. And so what we have done, what New Jersey has done, is looked at 2100 and said, we are going to base these on a moderate emissions scenario. So that's that. I don't know if you can see my my cursor, but that's this highlighted vertical column right here. We'll go to the next slide. I think we can. Whoops, no, we'll go back one. I thought I had this in here twice, highlighting it in different ways, but I was more efficient than that. The DEP went back and forth. So here's where a judgment call comes into play. It went back and forth between the 50% chance and the approximate 17% chance. And originally there was discussion about, well, maybe we'll go on the 50% chance likely range based on the moderate emissions scenario, and talk about an increase of sea level rise of 3.3%. And then policy folks started to think about what that would mean. And what that means is there's a 50% likelihood that that's going to happen. And so what we also know from climate science is it has always underestimated the impacts of the climate crisis. We've consistently underestimated the impacts. So policy makers made a decision based on public health and safety to really look at the 17% chance. So what we're saying is, after we've crunched all this data, is that under the moderate emission scenario, so we're going to still work really hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there is still approximately a 17% chance that sea level rise is going to increase 5.1 feet. That's what we're based on. So if you think about that in terms of, if there was a a 17% chance that your house was going to set on fire, would you take action to try to minimize that risk? And most common sense people would. So that's what we're doing here for safety reasons, for residents, for economic reasons, for our businesses, for our environment, is really trying to plan based on these moderate emissions scenarios with the 17%. And that's what we're using, this 5.1 increase, 5.1 feet increase in sea level rise. And Tim and Lucia are going to get into that in a moment.
Jen,
Yeah,
let me ask two clarifying questions.
sure.
One, we're saying moderate emissions. So we're doing some things to reduce emissions, but we're not nearly reaching the targets that climate scientists say we should.
Yeah, we're not necessarily meeting the Paris Agreement, and right now we're falling behind that anyway. So it's more of a realistic forecast.
All right. And then maybe I may have misunderstood one thing, but what we were targeting at this 5.1 is that there is a 83% chance that sea level rise won't be as bad as
Yes, my bad. Yeah.
and there's a 17% chance we're going to exceed it.
Yes, thank you, Mike, for clarifying that. There's a 17% chance that we're going to exceed it, an 83% chance that we are going to at least likely see the 5.1 feet.
And at that 50% chance, basically we're flipping a coin. If we had set the standards at 50%, we were just as likely as to exceed it as we were to meet those.
Correct. Thank you for clarifying that for me. It was clear in my head and came out jumbled in my mouth. So
Sounds good.
I appreciate it. I've only got about a minute and a half left here, and then I'm going to turn it over. So what these rules do, the NJPACT rules themselves are not a new set of regulations. What they do is go in and adjust existing regulations that we have that oversee the development and redevelopment of certain areas and aspects of our lives. So there are rule sections for sea level rise and inundation, environmental enhancements, because as I said, migration and habitats are changing very quickly. There's coastal climate protection and improved stormwater management, which I'm thrilled about because I've been looking for that one for about 25 years of what we're going to do in these regulations. And so we're going to have experts talk about that in a moment. We'll go to the next slide, Mike. And so just a very quick overview. The DEP lent me this slide, and they have actively been working on putting these regulations together since 2020. The current data set, the NOAA Atlas 14 data, is from 2016 and 2019, and that data will be updated very soon. That's not to say they've only been working on this since 2020. We've known our regulations have not been as protective as they should be for a long time. It's just that we needed the science to back up the policy. So this is a little bit of background of what's been done. We'll go to the next slide. This is the expected timeline. The rules were introduced on August 5th. The state of New Jersey has legally 1 year to adopt the regulations. So we are currently in an open public comment period. And so these regulations must be adopted by August 5th of 2025 or they expire. And I don't want to think about that scenario. So we are going to see these regulations adopted by August 5th of 2025. Next slide. Throughout this presentation tonight, we're going to give some opportunities to dispel some misinformation because there is unfortunately lots of misinformation about the environment and climate in general, and it started to take root for this regulation as well. I just want to talk for a second without giving too many people the flashback to statistic courses that I had earlier today in terms of some of the language that you might hear. And I pulled some quotes from this particular chapter from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll throw it in the chat, the link, so you can go find it for yourself as well. But essentially, they are looking at the same Atlas 14 data and trying to interpret for places that don't have a Center of Climatology and a Rutgers University, what this might mean for them and their communities. And there is absolute certainty that sea level rise is increasing. And there is absolute certainty that the melting glacial ice is the cause of that. When you may hear in some very scientific and technical reports, some language about low confidence. So there's a state technical advisory plan that these rules are based on. And there are some people who are working to develop in these low-lying areas who then want to sell their development for a profit, and that's their right to do in this country, but they walk away and then leave the risk with the new small business owner or the risk with the resident. And so they have pulled out and started talking about there's low confidence, and the scientists are saying there's low confidence in these scientific reports that these regulations are built on. That's absolutely false. They are using the statistical term of art out of context. Low confidence does not mean low quality. It means there are not a ton of studies that are doing this kind of global analysis that show what the collapse of the Arctic winds and the collapse of the Gulf Stream are doing to weather patterns globally. We are confident in the science that we do have, and confident that the impacts are going to be at least where we have set them. As we said, there's a 17% chance they will be worse than the 5.1 feet increase in sea level rise, but we're saying there's an 83% chance it's going to be at least that bad. So that's what we're going to plan for and try to turn the curve on protecting our communities. So with that, hopefully that's as much science as you could possibly want on a Monday night. And I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Tim Dillingham, the executive director at American Littoral Society, who's going to start walking us through what the regulations based on science are actually doing. So Tim, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. The only thing better than an evening full of science is an evening full of regulatory discussion. I think the rules are trying to address the very real facts, as Jen was describing them, about the impact of sea level rise, in particular as a consequence of climate change, on development, both existing and future development to come to the shore and other areas that are affected by tidal waters. There are some aspects of it that apply to the freshwater systems, those components along the coastline, but most of the focus, on the new changes are around the coast itself in relationship to sea level rise. The proposals, and I think we're all still working to completely understand them, but they have a couple tools that they utilize. One is new approaches and new regulatory standards applied to new places, capturing and closing regulatory loopholes on development that contributes to the problems that are consequence of climate change, increased precipitation, changes in flooding patterns. And then really interesting approach that we're very, very supportive of is the idea of relying on Mother Nature, going back and restoring some of the natural features along the coastline, salt marshes, beaches, oyster reefs, those types of natural or elements utilizing what they call nature-based approaches, and relying on those to help mitigate and reduce some of the risk that our communities, as well as the ecological communities on the coastline, stand to suffer from. So the sea level rise, the rules propose an adjustment to the coastal flood hazard areas. They're doing this to account for increased storm surge due to rising sea levels, the extending the jurisdiction of a set of the rules that DEP employs, the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, coastal zone management rules, further inland, and requiring increased elevation and flood proofing in response to, as Jen was talking about, the anticipated scope of how far water will come under predicted sea level rise. The climate adjusted flood elevation, CAFE, is the way that they describe the zones and the response to this in the regulatory context. So they've mapped out and have predicted where this water is going to extend to. They're kind of putting a difference in treating water that inundates an area, right, which is water that sort of permanently stands there, and flood hazard waters that will retreat. The rules themselves establish a modification of how high above the base flood elevation you need to be. It's a +5, the FEMA base flood elevation +5. And then they've applied that probably not as broadly as many in the environmental community might like, but trying to target where there are opportunities to reduce risk with this new knowledge. And so the regulations apply to new development, and there's a couple classifications in there: redevelopment and substantial improvements to structures. Contrary to a lot of the rhetoric that's dominating the media, it does not create no build zones. It does require floodproofing and elevating of qualifying structures. The next slide, please. So the inundation risk zone is the area in which they're going to bring a slightly separate or different set of tools to bear. As you can see in the slide, it refers to the area that's at risk of daily tidal inundation associated with the projected sea level rises. It requires risk assessment and acknowledgement. So there's a lot of weight being placed on the idea that if folks are conscious of the risk that is being posed by a certain structure or development within a certain place, that it might help to influence the way that they design that structure and proceed. And it is, perhaps surprising, but not surprising, that there are many, many people who don't understand or are not aware of even the current flood risks along waterways, along the shoreline, without adding on the exacerbation that's going to come by with climate change. So, as part of that process, in the regulatory process, there'll be a requirement to do an on-site alternatives assessment. They'll require the applicants to look for places to pull the development out of the higher hazard area, to look at different materials, different designs to address the anticipated impacts that are coming. Again, it requires elevations, it requires flood proofing, but it doesn't prohibit building. And I think that's going to sort of leave a future challenge, because or just by consequence, the flooding are going to be areas that are going to be inundated. And you think about the risks that are posed both to homeowners, business owners, and first responders having to go out into hazard areas that are inundated or that are subject to higher wave energies, stronger moving water. From our perspective, you have to really start to think about the wisdom in directing or allowing development to happen in those places. But these rules don't prohibit it in exchange for this idea of thinking about the risk, having to acknowledge it affirmatively within the regulatory process, looking at alternatives, and then meeting the elevation standards. Okay, next slide. These are the additional new protections that rely upon nature-based solutions for resiliency. The American Littoral Society has done a lot of these projects since Hurricane Sandy in particular, where we've rebuilt beaches, established flood management, interchanges with the ocean, rebuild oyster reefs. So there's a role for this natural coastal climate protection to play in reestablishing a lot of the coastline that we've lost. And when we've lost that, we have lost the values that they provide. There's been some research done primarily by the Nature Conservancy, I think, but others are now looking at it about the cost reduction that comes from having wide, expansive marshes and healthy beaches. And there's a cost savings that could be monetized there about how these approaches will help us protect the communities and critical infrastructure, as well as give back to the natural infrastructure, right? If you draw your circle big enough, you come to understand that because we have healthy marshes, or where we have healthy marshes, we have healthy fisheries, and we have a healthy fishing industry in association with that. It really is some of the practices that are being talked about here: living shorelines, marsh restoration, reusing sediment from within the estuarine systems that we're dredging it out of, will all add to those positives on the far side of this. And then in the rule, there's a whole series of changes that will make facilitating and permitting these types of projects easier. And there are we've gone from thinking about them as simply filling the waters to realizing that there's all these values that come from restoration projects. New Jersey has lost over 50% of its tidal wetlands base since the Europeans came, and clearly there's a lot to be put back and a lot of value we can gain by that. So we're very supportive of the rules, where they've made new allowances for living shorelines, for the way they handle that, for encouraging the beneficial use of sediments in dredging projects. Okay, next. Again, this is sort of examples of what I was talking about. They're updating the permitting language from living shorelines, which really for practitioners of coastal restoration is one type of practice. So they're broadening the idea to nature-based solutions to get more innovation, I think, involved, as well as to allow a broader set of practices to be allowable and permittable. By the way, this is a Littoral Society project down at the mouth of the Morris River in Cumberland County. And what we're doing there is that chain offshore where the barge is working. Those are breakwaters that are seeded with oysters. And it's reducing the wave energy, which is eating away at this marsh, which is called Basket Flats. This marsh, that peninsula that sticks out there, is the only thing that stands between the open ocean and Delaware Bay and the port of Bivalve, where a lot of the oyster fleet is. As I said earlier, we've treated these projects like fill in the past, right? So now we're starting to say, well, there's public value to come out of being able to change the shoreline footprint. We're also protecting the natural dune systems that are left in the state by clarifying that even when the state and the municipalities and the Army Corps of Engineers undertake beach skirmishing projects, that doesn't reduce the value or the importance of natural dune systems. And then, the regulatory aspect of it is it requires proposals and projects to justify why they're not using nature-based approaches. So that becomes the preferred alternative. But there is a safety valve, so to speak, if you want to think about it that way, that there's a demonstration that can be made that it's impracticable, but also requiring a very articulated evaluation of the consequences of the shoreline ecosystem. Next slide. There's a planning aspect to the state's coastal rules, to the application of the Coastal Area Facilities Review Act, or CAFRA, that came about in the early 90s, when the state first adopted its development and redevelopment plan. And there was a move to have those two plans, the plan under the state plan and the rules under the CZN rules, to sync up as well as possible, but also to help give CAFRA and the CZN rules some planning basis. So the planning areas, which range from urbanized developing lands to conservation areas, that type of mapping was applied throughout the coastal zone. And inside those broader planning areas, there were centers where growth was to be developed towards, where infrastructure investment, like sewers and water, were to be located, and where the development was allowed to be more intensive. So you had centers surrounded by these broad planning areas that had a range of the landscape, so you can see down the shore. So the rule is going to propose the deletion of the coastal centers on the barrier islands, for the straightforward idea that the barrier islands are likely to be inundated at some point in the future, and that directing growth, or continuing to direct growth towards them, is basically a moral hazard, right? We're encouraging people to go into places that we know are going to be risky and vulnerable in the future. So there are, and then some of the expiration of that center then will affect the technical parts of the CAFRA rules that establish impervious cover limits, as well as the amount of vegetation you have to retain on a site if it's present, or to replant if it's not. So it really is establishing a policy that is helping to minimize the amount of growth and development that's happening in these areas, which are really most vulnerable along the coastline. Okay, next. Okay, so that's a really high and probably spotty overview of the rules, but I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Lucia Osborne.
And I'm going to turn it right over to Mike.
Fair enough.
Oh,
You know,
sorry.
Tim, let me ask you a quick question. The deletion of the centers does not in and of itself make anyone do anything with existing development. What is there at this moment.
I don't think any of these rules substantively affect existing development. You know, the triggers, so to speak, are when you make substantial improvements, and that's a carryover from very standard practice in flood hazard area management. When if you rebuild a building that was built in 1971, you should bring it up to the modern standards. But the centers themselves, the big change will be what is the impervious coverage of a site if you're subject to CAFRA regulation.
Thanks. Yeah, just so you know, some people are crying the removal of the centers, but that's something that's been around for 20, 30 years at this point, and won't do anything except for prospectively. All right, stormwater management. I got here a picture of one of many pictures of why it's so important. If you know the area, this is the parking lot of Wildflowers off of the Pennington Circle. On August 6th, when we got 6 or 7 inches of rain in an hour. That was almost hip deep in spots. So going back to Jen's comment that, you know, we're having different patterns, different intensity of rain, and what was normal is no longer, and what we were designing for in the past is no longer. So these rules have a couple big aspects to them, and then there are some, I'm not going to say minor aspects, but more technical and wonky. So I'm going to hit some of the big picture items. This this, as Jen was saying, we've been calling for improvements to our stormwater management for 20 years. This has probably been one of the biggest ticket items we've been asking for since the start of our modern stormwater management, and that is the volumetric reduction, or as most people call it, on-site retention. And really what that gets at is reducing flooding. This is a picture of a basin in my development after that storm, where basically we were at overflow. And this was a couple hours after that storm had hit. But right now, the way stormwater management works, even though you will have heard the phrase quantity, quality, and recharge, quantity does not mean quantity. It means peak rate reductions. We are going to slow down the volume that we release from our stormwater systems. But in reality, because we're creating impervious cover, we are going to increase the volume. The NJPACT real rules is starting to flip that. We are now going to require developments to come in and retain on site what we've called the water quality design storm. We design other things for the water quality design storm, water quality. So DEP picked that 1.25 inches over 2 hours to be retained on site using green infrastructure or through the removal and reduction of impervious surfaces. So this will start to get at that flooding problem that we've been experiencing, we all experience, and is getting worse. And that is, again, one of the big ones. And this applies for both development and redevelopment. Come on. And I apparently highlighted a bunch of stuff. There we go. Redevelopment. So, Tim, you may recognize this site in Hopewell Borough. So currently, when we redevelop sites, when we take a site that has already been developed, has impervious surface, this site probably has 95%, 98% of its surface is impervious. The pavement is probably all broken up, so it's probably maybe 95 or 93%. We don't require this development when someone comes in, tries to rehab and redevelopment, to do that quantity, quality, and recharge requirements. We may, under some circumstances, require them to do a removal of 50% of the total suspended solids, but not always, because our rules say if you don't increase the motor vehicle surfaces by 1/4 acre, you don't have to do water quality. If you don't disturb an acre of soil, you don't have to do quantity or recharge. And if you have to do quantity or recharge, all you have to do is match what's there. And if your rate reductions is, I only have to match the rate or reduce it, I'm going to match the rate. And if it's coming off there at the speed of light, all I have to do is match that, because there is no stormwater management. The proposal, which again is something we've been asking for quite a while, at least 10 plus years, is make redevelopment address these problems. Now, we got half a loaf. I'll be honest with that. So you must address quality. You must treat the water quality, the total suspended solids, by 80%, which is the standard, unless you're discharging into a category 1 water when it's 95. You must address nutrients to the maximum extent practicable, and you've got to do that volumetric reduction. So you're you're treating the water that's running off, which is good. You are reducing some of the volume, but you're not getting the recharge or the rate reductions. But this is a really good step in the right direction, because we're not going to get really a handle on our flooding and water quality problems unless we start to handle our legacy development. If you think about it, most stormwater management, modern stormwater management, occurred in 2004. We've been doing it in New Jersey on a state since the mid 80s. But as Jen mentioned, we're one of the original 13 colonies. A lot of our development, a lot of our urban and older suburban areas were developed way before we had stormwater management. So if we don't take the opportunity when we redevelopment to start fixing these problems, we're never going to reduce flooding or improve water quality. All right, next slide. And I have no idea why I did this or even how I did the highlights. Total maximum daily loads. Here's another thing we've been asking for at least 10 years or longer. Most of New Jersey's waters do not meet federal standards. So they're not clean enough for recreation. They're not clean enough for aquatic life. They're not clean enough for drinking water standards. And when they're not clean enough, we have to develop total maximum daily loads. How much of a load reduction do we have to have in our waterways in order to meet the standards? I have a graph from the Raritan Basin TMDL, which at least for Carnegie Lake shows we'd have to reduce from stormwater 84% in the Stony Brook watershed of existing load. But how do we get there? So these new rules, which is phenomenal, and we've been asking for it for many years, we must take into consideration these plans, these total maximum daily loads, as we review and approve development. If we are discharging to waters that are already impaired, how do we do better so that we fix the problem, not make it worse, but make it worse less? This is huge. Still noodling through exactly how this is going to be implemented. But this is something I have been arguing the Clean Water Act has been requiring us to do for a decade or longer. So this is huge. Climate change resiliency. You know, a few years ago, the state updated the municipal land use law to require municipalities in their master plan to adjust climate change and resiliency in master planning. This is taking a look at stormwater. So towns, as part of the stormwater management plan, has to take a look at what is climate change going to do to our stormwater system? What is climate change going to do to our flooding? Is it going, you know, what are these increase in flooding, increase in rainfall amounts going to do? Is some of our basins going to be underwater because they're too close to the waterways? Are the outfalls going to be underwater? And so if you have outfalls that are underwater because the stream has risen, you're not going to have a whole lot of water coming out of those stormwater systems. So what's the impacts are going to be, and what can a municipality do to address that? So again, this is more of a planning aspect and starting to people think, how do we start to prepare for the future? Flood Hazard Control Act is the next one. And this is, again, huge. I think the last time DEP updated the flood hazard rules, that was also a 1,000-page proposal where the Christie administration undid lots of good things. This rule puts back some, but not all of those things that were taken away. All right, we talked about the climate adjusted flood elevation. Tim talked about that earlier. So instead of having the flood hazard area design flood elevation, we're now having the CAFE standard. Also, so the flood hazard rules has a bunch of abilities to build into the riparian zone or the flood hazard area. You have certain amount of allowances. I think at table 11 point, oh God, I forget what the table is. When the 2016 and 2017 rules came out, we hated that table because, you know, for example, you could build a 2,000 square foot accessory building in the flood hazard area by right. This at least adds into it if you need relief from the allowances to show that your request for a hardship is because of a compelling public need, not just because we want a bigger warehouse, but we're exceeding the standards because we are meeting a essential health or safety need. We need this to meet those existing needs. There's no other way to meet the needs. Think about a roadway to a hospital. Think about, you know, first responders, things like that. And this sort of takes from what has been in the freshwater wetlands regulations for a number of years and brings it over into the flood hazard. Again, a good step. One would argue maybe we shouldn't have so many allowances in the flood hazard area in the riparian zone, but at least we're starting to ask some of the right questions and putting in processes to judge whether these hardships are really hardships. We're doing a lot of changes and enhancements to the riparian zone. In the 2016 rules, we took away a 25-foot setback along waterways that have a bulkhead retaining wall. And the thought was, well, we have the retaining wall, we don't need to provide this buffer. I think DEP's experience says we do. And from a water quality perspective, we still need some area of land to slow down and filter. So they are putting that back in. For some reason under the rules, and Tim Lucia, you may remember the reason why we decided that, Barnegat Bay has a riparian zone on the mainland, but not on the barrier islands. Because I guess water pollution didn't come from the barrier islands and didn't need protecting. I'm not sure why we did that, but we did. But now we're putting that riparian zone back in on the bay side of the barrier islands, not on the ocean side. But we're at least recognizing that these islands, this development has a water quality impact to the bay, and also the bay has an impact on those islands. And by providing a riparian zone, we're creating a buffer from development to sort of accommodate some of that increased flooding, isolated waters. So in many parts of the state, we have karst topography, limestone, where streams would come, they would disappear into the ground and then reappear downwards. And the way our rules work, part of that may become an isolated stream and doesn't get a riparian zone, even though we can quite clearly trace that water from point A to where it reemerges. These proposals are now protecting and creating a riparian zone along these segments that might be isolated, but really are one stream. They just disappear into the ground through karst topography for a period of time. So this, again, will be protecting water quality. We're putting back riparian zones along human-created channels. So there's vegetation and land along some of these fully encased channels. And we're no longer calling them man-made, we are calling them human-created. Again, understanding that while they may be artificial, there's still a water quality and volume component, and that they are still providing a channel or a conduit for the streams, and that the more we can keep the pollution, the more we can keep the volume out of these channels, the less that gets into our natural waterways. And then we are expanding the species, threatened and endangered species, that we look at to whether we decide whether a stream will have 150-foot riparian zone or 50 or 300. That got tightened up a few years ago, and now we're bringing it back, understanding that there are more species that use these waterways than the rules recognize, and that by protecting that riparian zone, we're protecting the habitat for these species and giving them a chance to survive. And I'm going through a lot of this really, really quickly. And then some additional changes. And some of it is bringing us into compliance with the Federal Emergency Management Agency FEMA requirements. We were out of step with them, and where we were less protective. And we cannot, federal government provides the floor. The state has to at least be as protective as that floor. So bringing those back into alignment. We're looking to FEMA mapping for a lot of our elevations, and if you have a difference of opinion on whether those FEMA maps are accurate for your site, you don't go to DEP anymore to go argue with that. You go to FEMA to get a revision. The FEMA maps are controlling. And then there's a lot of changes. We have permit by rule, where if you meet certain requirements, you are sort of granted by operation of law authority to do certain activities, permits by certification. And what DEP is saying, we have no idea who is operating on our permit by rule. We have no idea what development's going on, that we have deemed not to have an impact because it's de minimis or not having a huge impact, but we have no idea. So by switching to permit by registration, we're still requiring, you're still being allowed to do things by law, but you at least have to notify DEP that these activities are occurring, that you're going to do it, that you did it. And so that over time, we have a better understanding of the impacts to our watershed. So that as we plan projects, as we look at revisions, as we look at what's going on, we have an understanding what the causes are. Otherwise, it was sort of, I don't want to say Wild West, but you really didn't have a really fine-grained concept of why you were having an impairment somewhere because you didn't know how many people were taking advantage of that permit by rule because they didn't have to tell anyone. And then wetlands protections. Lucia, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. Yeah, so, the wetlands protection rules, they kind of fall under that bucket of environmental enhancements, which Jen mentioned. And they were also done to create some consistency with the flood hazard area rules that Mike was just talking about. So, as we mentioned before, these PACT rules are not so much new rules, so much as they are revisions and corrections to existing rules to help to close loopholes and make them work more efficiently. So these freshwater wetlands protections, they, specifically are targeting the Freshwater Wetland Protection Act rule. And working to strengthen them. They also, really make it a point to acknowledge the value that wetlands provide. So, they are natural carbon sinks, which help to, reduce the total number of greenhouse gases that we have out there. They provide critical habitat for many, many wildlife species. And they also help to clean our water. So they're very important. Specifically targeting freshwater wetlands is really important because a lot of, there's a lot of coastal wetlands that kind of already fall under those CAFRA rules, but these freshwater wetlands, may not be in those zones that Tim was talking about earlier. So, the one big thing that I think is really important is it strengthens the rules to require that applicants show that their stormwater management practices are in compliance if they're impacting a freshwater wetland. So the old rules, you really only had to say, hey, we're following the rules, we're doing what we need, what we're supposed to be doing if you were building directly on a wetland. Now we're saying if you're impacting the wetland, right? So maybe that'll be in your drainage area. It also, if you are going to impact a wetland, you have to justify why you're doing this. Is there an alternative way that you could design your project? Is there, an alternative site that you can use? What other methods that you can use? The other thing that's important, and this is, a really big theme, is that it's requiring your projects to think about how climate change will impact your mitigation, right? So it's not just, I know this stormwater management that's going to impact a wetland is good for today, but will it be good for the increases in precipitation that we're expected to see with climate change? Will it be good for, the future, and will it withstand the changes that were coming? Next slide, please. So, this is something that I think is really, really important and I'm very, very supportive of. And, if you want to protect your wetlands and recognize the values of wetlands, I hope that you think this is, very important and something that you'll support as well. It does require the removal of existing impervious surfaces within 25 feet of a wetland when redevelopment activities are taking place. So that, again, I want to highlight, that's when redevelopment activities are taking place. So unless you're redesigning a site, rebuilding something, they're not going to say you have to dig up your parking lot or your driveway or whatever is there. But if you are redesigning that site, that's when they're saying, let's get that impervious surface out of there because it really shouldn't be there. And that was a miss in the past. This is an opportunity for us to do better. And also, I just want to point out that language is when practicable. So, if you can justify that this really doesn't make sense for a given project, you know, you can get a workaround, you can get kind of, you can get excused from that portion of the rule. And then the other thing, which really lines up with those Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules that Mike was just talking about, is that they ask new development to be situated at least 25 feet from a freshwater wetland. Again, you know, there are some exceptions that can be made if you can really justify your case. But again, that's just a little bit about wetlands, which I think are so important to our state and our ecosystem. So, you know, I hope you all are supportive of those portions of the rules. The next thing I want to get into are some of the myths that, you know, we've been hearing. But actually, before I do that, or, you know, maybe I'll just say one of the myths we've been hearing is that these rules are way too strict, and that there's no relief, and that how are people supposed to comply with all these? So, Mike, if you want to just jump in and talk about relief valves, and then I'll talk about myths.
Yeah. So, you know, we're hearing a lot about as Lucia mentioned, these are too strict. You're going to create no build zones. But you know, frankly, there are, as all rules have, there are relief valves, whether they're waivers or variances or exceptions. You know, for stormwater, you know, there's at least 6 categories of activities that are exempt from meeting the major development requirements if you meet those exempt categories. Public transportation entities, so you know, your municipality, your county, the state that are building roadways, have exceptions. And again, we can argue whether we should have these exceptions or not. You know, in some instances, I would argue maybe we shouldn't, but they're there. You know, so if the transportation entity has met an alternative milestone, so they looked at multiple alternatives, they picked it, whether it is a federally funded project, so you went through a NEPA process or an internal process. If sort of the design has been determined that that alternative has already been selected, these rules aren't going to make that agency go back and relook at everything. You know, they're adding flexibility to, instead of move away from the small scale best management practice, the stormwater management that the green infrastructure rule added in 2020, adding flexibility for large scale versus small scale, understanding that DOT may have limited widths and roadway right of ways to do their things. Again, we can argue whether they should or shouldn't have this one. And then there are going to be circumstances like for the on-site retention or for the quality, you can't fully meet the requirement with what you got. And so there's a relief valve that these public transportation entities don't have to go to the full. So if you cannot meet the full water quality treatment, you only have to go to 50%. Again, I would have some quibbles with that, but there are these relief valves. Again, with the volumetric reduction, that on-site retention, if you can't necessarily do it on site, you have other options. And with the flood hazard rules, again, you meet those milestones, you don't have to go back and redesign your project. We're not looking at the entire road. We're only looking at that portion of the road that you're actually addressing. And you don't even have to go through this if you're improving a roadway for safety or good repair, and there's no other really reasonable opportunity to meet standards. We're not, you know, the DEP is not going to make you do that. So these are just sort of a smattering of some of these exceptions or relief valves. Tim mentioned one earlier, where these rules aren't going to apply at all, or on a very limited basis, you know, for various policy reasons. So these are not creating, you know, what I would postulate, you know, as draconian rules that there is no exceptions to. These are not, again, de facto creating no build zones because you can't meet the standards. There are ways to address hardships. There are ways to address unique site-specific conditions. So, and with that, lots of misinformation going out there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm back. So yeah, I think a lot of us have heard some either really crazy things or things that are just not true, or maybe some things that people aren't really understanding. So we wanted to take a moment to, you know, take the things that we've heard and that we've seen people say or claim and just explain why that's either true or not true. So the first thing that, we've heard a lot is that the real rules will create no build zones. We've said this many, many times throughout this presentation, but it does not create no build zones. Where you are developing, if it is a flood prone area, if it is in that, CAFE, that climate adjusted flood elevation area, or an inundation risk zone, you need to understand that. So you need to do your risk assessment and make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. And then you also need to build appropriately. So that may mean elevating your house. That may mean different types of flood proofing. And I think that's all just smart rules. If you know that the home you're building is likely to flood in a couple of decades, then let's make sure that it can be protected and it can, have the best chance of withstanding that. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so another thing that we've heard a lot is that the real rules will stop development and would result in less affordable housing. And I think this is a big one. And I think this is really important because affordable housing is something that every single community needs. And I just, a couple things I want to say to this is that the funding buckets for affordable housing are still going to be there. So affordable housing is largely subsidized by state and federal funding. Those aren't going to go away. What they are saying is that if you are building affordable housing in a flood prone area, it needs to be safe. And I just think, if housing is not safe, it's not affordable, right? The people who are living there are going to pay one way or another. And really, when you think about putting people who are probably more vulnerable in a situation where they're less likely to be protected from a flood, I think that's morally wrong, right? And I'm not just talking about flood elevation vulnerability, but when you're talking about people who are living in affordable housing, they're likely have a lower income, they're less likely to have an emergency savings, they're more likely to have, if they are a homeowner, a high deductible insurance in favor of kind of a lower monthly payment. They're less likely to have certain safety nets, even simple things that you may not think of, like time off of work to handle a situation if your home does get flooded, replacing damaged items and property and things that you own. There's just so many more levels of vulnerability that these people experience. And to say that, we shouldn't make affordable housing safe is kind of ridiculous to me. So I just really want to say that these rules are not intended to make housing less affordable. They're intended to make housing in flood prone areas safe for everyone, regardless of whether or not you're living in market value homes or housing that is, considered more affordable or for lower income people. Next slide, please. That it'll cost too much for communities. That's another really big thing that comes up. And I think it's a fair and valid concern, right? So there's concerns about just the cost of making these changes to building and development, and then also concerns about lost ratables. So there's some really interesting information out there. One report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce found that for every $1 invested in resiliency practices, $6 in cleanup costs are saved, and then another $7 in economic costs. So that's, time off work and lost wages, business closures, things like that are saved. So that's really, for every $1 invested, we're actually saving $13 in recovery from a major storm event or a major flood. And then the other thing to think about too is communities are already paying for it. We've already been paying for the cost of cleanup for years and years and years in New Jersey. It's close to $6 billion. I think it's, I wrote it in the slide. $5.8 billion in federal funding have been spent rebuilding flooded properties in the state. And then when you think about, again, those other economic costs like lost wages, it's been over 50 million. And then, this photo right here, this is Thompson's Beach. This is a community that used to exist on Delaware Bay down in South Jersey. And this is the fireplace of a house. It's really the last kind of structure that's on that beach. This is a community that was eventually abandoned because they lost their beach to erosion, and eventually a tidal wave came and destroyed a lot of homes. They dealt with recurring flooding, and it just became impracticable, I'll say, for them, and financially not doable for them to keep fixing and rebuilding. So eventually people abandoned those communities. So if you're concerned about losing ratables, you know, I think you're more likely to lose them by keeping people at risk and letting them experience continued flooding when you can make regulations that will help to keep their homes there and keep their businesses open. So next slide, please. Oh, this is another one too. You know, I heard one guy say he can't redo the siding on his house, or if you need to make a, you know, a simple improvement like replace your windows or a roof, you know, a roof replacement, that's not true. So, you know, we mentioned those cafe zones, and we also mentioned those inundation risk zones and how they only apply to new development, redevelopment. So if you're, you know, knocking down your home and completely rebuilding it, or substantial improvements. So I just want to clarify that substantial improvements are improvements that are at least 50% of the value of your home. You know, I was on Zillow earlier today and found that the average home value in New Jersey is $539,000. It was nice to know that I am below average. So I'm currently always, you know, nice to get that. But anyway, unless you're doing hundreds of thousands of dollars in renovations to your home, it is unlikely to trigger this substantial improvement category for the cafe rule. So, you know, people can still make necessary improvements to their home. They can paint their kitchen, remodel their bathroom. It's only when you're doing really large renovations that these cafe rules or those climate adjusted flood elevation rules will take effect. And I think that may have been it. Do I have anything else after that?
That is it from myths.
Oh, yeah.
I would say, and I was trying to recall, I was trying to find this, but at the beginning of August, the Senate Environment and Assembly Environment had a joint hearing on climate change and these rules. And I forget which of the speakers, but mentioned that New Jersey is number 3 in federal relief claims, FEMA claims. So we're number 3 in the nation in dollars paid out because of disasters, and that's flooding by and large. When you think of our competition like Florida and Louisiana and Texas, that says something. So we are paying one way or the other. And the question is, do we do it proactively by reducing risk and trying to keep people's lives a bit safer, keeping them a bit out of harm's way, or do we pay it by coming in after the fact and having to fix everything over and over and over again? So please put any questions you may have in the question and answer. So far, we don't have any, which means we've explained everything crystal clear. And there are no questions on the 1,000-page rule. There are 2 public hearings coming up, and one is this Thursday at 12 o'clock. I mean, Thursday, September 12th at 2 o'clock. And the next one is Thursday, September 19th at 10 a.m. There's information there, or you can just Google NJDEP Real, and they will bring you to their, they have the information here. And then, let's see, we do have a couple questions. Yes, we will be providing the recording. As a matter of fact, the moment we hit end, it should be on YouTube. And then, any relation to Flood Defense Act requirements for towns with stormwater utilities? Does someone want to take that, Jen? Or
Excuse me. Can you repeat that question?
Sure.
I'm looking for it right now.
Any relationship to Flood Defense Act, which is the Stormwater Utilities Act or the Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act of 2019?
Right. So, yes and no. If you're talking about the higher level problem of we need to address our built environment in New Jersey if we hope to significantly reduce the impacts of flooding. Again, we are an old community, we are an old state. We have a lot of pre-existing development, and the redevelopment provisions in the stormwater section of these NJPACT reels start to chip away at that problem because old development does not manage stormwater. And so you're not going to be able to get away with that anymore when you're redeveloping. In relationship to the Flood Defense Act, the stormwater utility, that's a much more comprehensive and proactive response to looking at the situation as it is and what is causing the impacts of flooding, unmanaged stormwater runoff from impervious covers, and saying we now have to charge a fee so that we can build infrastructure to manage that, rather than just simply waiting for a redevelopment to happen at some point in time and not having control of it. The Flood Defense Act really kind of grabs control of the problem and is more proactive. So in that sense, yes, but in the sense that we're looking forward to 2100 and incorporating the situation as we know it's going to develop, or at least the minimal situation it's going to develop, no. So yes and no. Sorry for the equivocation on that answer.
That was almost a good attorney answer. I would add, municipalities have an obligation now under their municipal separate storm source system permit, the MS4 permit, to make sure all the systems are being maintained. That costs money, and towns and the public works departments are under multiple obligations and multiple demands. And I don't know that any town is truly funding the needs of stormwater maintenance. Stormwater utility is a way to get at what has to be done, the cleanings, the fixing up, the restoring of stuff. So it may help flooding by just making sure everything is working the way it's supposed to be. All right, next question. Are there concerns that these rules will promote greenfield development over redevelopment? My short answer is no, but panelists, what do you think?
I don't think so. Just having worked in New Jersey and land use for more than 20 years, I really don't see that. I don't see that happening.
I'll agree with both of you. And I also just want to say there's, language in the rules. For example, with the Flood Hazard Area Control Act and the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act rule revisions that specifically, try to discourage building in certain areas like those 25-foot buffers. So I think the rules were written, with the intention to protect critical spaces. And then also, Tim, you're probably about to say this because you're coming out of mute, but I'm thinking of the critical environmental sites in the CAFRA rules as well.
Yeah, I think the rule, on Lucia's last point there, the rules have some protections to ensure that new development doesn't go into environmentally sensitive areas on top of the rules that already apply. I think there are, from our perspective, there aren't a lot of limitations on greenfield development now. But I think in this instance, we're really talking about development that, for better or worse, wants to be close to the coastline or wants to be close to the edge of the water. And that market demand, I don't think will go away anytime soon. So hence the need for regulation, because people's generally fundamental understanding of risk associated with living along tidal waters, as well as what will be exacerbated by climate change, it doesn't outweigh, and even in addition with the market, doesn't guide them to safe places. So I think to the extent that government has an obligation to protect its citizens from harm, we enact all sorts of laws to do that, and that's really the premise of these rules, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of market forces directing us back to our urban and older suburban areas with creating walkable and recreating walkable communities, and that's where the market demand is, not necessarily the boondocks. I don't mean that pejoratively, but out of the middle of nowhere. So let's see. Is there any concern? Are there any concerns with the rules and recommendations for improvement? As any rule, we didn't get everything we want. But this is a really good down payment. We mentioned some areas of improvement and some areas of policy issues. I mean, do we really want, should we have no build zones? Should we have full stormwater requirements for redevelopment as we do for greenfields? We got a good down payment, but we didn't get everything. You know, pulling back 25 feet is great, but you know, some transition areas, those buffers to wetlands are really 50 feet. So shouldn't we do that? There's a lot. I don't know if anyone has sort of the top, oops, it's not in the rule, but should be.
I'll just say, I really appreciate the work that the DEP put into these rules. And I understand that they really tried to stay true to that concept of not creating any no build zones. As someone who works to care for the coast, I think building in the inundation risk zone is silly. I will say that. I think I've used more colorful language, with my colleagues. But if you're building in an area that you know is likely to flood twice a day with the high tide within the next 75 years, I just don't think you should build there. And I would like to see those areas excluded from development entirely. I don't think, I don't expect that to happen in these rules, but that would be my biggest area for improvement with them.
All right. I know there's portions of the rule that deals with offshore wind development, but the question is, there seems to be concerns in Cape May County about these rules allowing exemptions for offshore wind development. Is this true? And so to what extent?
So
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Lucia.
No, go ahead, you go.
I was gonna say, so this, you're scratching the far reaches of my brain here. This comes under permissions or exemptions or conditions around utilities. And I know that in the previous flood hazard rules, so we didn't talk about the NJPACT flood hazard area protection rules tonight, but that was the first tranche of NJPACT rules that came out last year. There were originally sections that were way too permissive of utilities in terms of them being sited in floodplains. And so these rules actually tightened that up. And so we don't provide utility permission or land use regulation based on how we feel about the energy source. A utility is a utility is a utility. And so there are not specific exemptions in here. So far as I have read or understand at this point related to wind, it's a utility overall. And so there's always an analysis of societal benefit that goes along with the construction of utility lines or transmission lines or any kind of utility. Lucia, does that sound about right?
Yeah, and I'll just add, so they do have what's called the submerged cable rules, which are more likely, even though a utility is a utility, more likely to be related to offshore wind energy for obvious reasons. And they're not so much exemptions as they are requirements for things like burial depth, and mitigation for shellfish and marine habitat. So looking at whether or not you're doing horizontal drilling, is it going through a shellfish reef? Are you, taking steps to mitigate that loss to the oyster or other shellfish habitat? There is, which this is something that I may not necessarily agree with, but there is an option to essentially make a financial contribution to offset the cost of mitigating the shellfish reefs. So essentially you can pay a fee to the DEP, which will then go towards rebuilding oyster reefs elsewhere if the construction of the underwater cables goes through shellfish habitat. So that's if I had to guess, that's probably what that person was asking about. I have it.
Thank you for that. I was thinking more of the inland, and once it's connected to the line and the transmission lines, and
yeah,
so thinking about the flood hazard section and how we tighten that up.
So if you want to like really look into that, I have it. It's 7:7, chapter 1221 is like where that section is. I can write it in the chat if people are specifically interested in that issue and want to dig into it.
And I will say I didn't point out, the freshwater wetlands changes also requires a general permit for HDD, horizontal directional drilling, which until now was assumed not to have wetland or transition area impacts, even though reality was vastly different. So now that they're requiring a permit and requiring some better safeguards than what we've had in the past. So that is a change. All right. Let's see. All right. Oh, this is a good one. Our city of Inglewood has had 4 major floods since the flooding of Ida 3 years ago. We've had 2 major floods in August of 2024. And we have also 30,000 people in 4.9 square miles. And we're concerned about adequate space for development, let alone affordable housing. How can we put pressure on our city elected officials to take action, especially without a moratorium on building? So yeah, that is, a big question. I mean, the one thing with this rule is all rules, the moment they are proposed, the moment there is a hint of proposal, every developer who has a hint of a thought of a development is getting their plans into DEP now so they can be legacied, or what we used to be called grandfathers, so they go under the old rules. There are a lot of things municipalities can do. One, they could have stronger stormwater management ordinances tomorrow if they wanted it. They could have stronger stream corridor ordinances if they wanted it tomorrow. They can change and revise their zoning to better protect. They could create a redevelopment standard tomorrow for all this. They don't have to wait for DEP. But do you all have other thoughts on what a town can do?
Yeah, I'll just add it's the hypothetical tomorrow, because we can help you start drafting something or send you documents, but you do have to go through the first reading and second reading of the ordinance.
Fine.
So hypothetical tomorrow. You do have in Inglewood an environmental commission, and I don't know if this person is an environmental commissioner. But starting with your EC and having conversations and checking out the lay of the land politically, do you have a champion, or do we need to help inspire a champion by creating relationships? If you want to email us at info@anjac.org, we can certainly work with you and do some brainstorming. That's info@anjac.org. I promise you that email is better monitored than my own. So if you go ahead and email us there, we could work with you. But yeah, everything that Mike said, those are great options. Better stormwater management, better riparian buffers, looking at your zoning and does your existing zoning make sense? Are all the right things to do.
All right.
I mean, just one, I think in response to how I read Diane's question, and I think you guys touched on it. I mean, clearly municipalities have a fair amount of authority to respond to the flooding issues by, redesign, rezoning. If you look at the city of Hoboken, right, has been really creative on how they've managed putting projects into place to increase the resiliency after the damage that was done in Hurricane Sandy. So it sounds like there's a political challenge more than a, excuse me, my colleague here, than a technical one. Although urban environments obviously pose some challenges that are unique to them, but there are people that are doing really interesting things to help go back in and put resiliency into urban spaces. And I'm not sure about, I would talk to an attorney about the moratorium question, about what are the grounds under which that can be established. I don't think there's a blanket prohibition, even though it would be very, very difficult in New Jersey to have that established. So.
All right. I think that is all of the questions. And so we are about 8:30, so a little bit longer than we promised y'all, but I think those were really good questions. I want to thank everyone for giving us their Monday evening. Lucia, Tim, Jen, thank you very much for lending your expertise tonight. Here is all of our contact information. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. And with that, again, thank you very much. We will be sending out this recording, so you will get to watch it when you can't sleep at night. I want to really know about the real rules. As we mentioned earlier, I'll bring that right back up. There are 2 more public hearings on these rules. It would be good for you to show your support for these rules. And then with that, everyone have a great evening. Panelists, thank you again so much. Appreciate it.
Like, real quick, if you can't attend the public hearings or hate public speaking, you can also submit a comment, like written comments. So that bottom box there, there's directions on how you can submit it. So if you can't attend or don't want to, still tell the DEP what you think and help get these rules passed.
You know what? And that's a good point. Thank you. The written comment period ends on November 3rd. So while public testimony is in the next week or 2, there's over a month to put together your thoughts and your comments. I will speak hopefully for all of us in that we will be putting together comments. We will be putting together comments for the public to use and to sign on to, as well as way more detailed ad nauseum with statutory sites and regulations and science for the organizations. But we will be sharing that with the public. If you are so interested, keep an eye on our websites. We will have an opportunity for you to sign on in support of these rules.
And Mike, I'm sorry. I think it's also important to tell folks that are not necessarily the technical experts that it's very important to just express support for the goal of the rules, right? It's not as if New Jersey is, wholly on a path to appropriately and wisely dealing with the impacts of climate change. So there's a political question here, again, that simply writing to the department and telling them that they're on the right path, that they're doing the right thing, that these are necessary, that they need to be done now will help counter the other pressures that we talked about during the seminar tonight.
Yes, absolutely. Ditto to what Tim said. As you can imagine, there are forces that are more well-funded than us that create negative narratives on these kind of things. So knowing that you're there to support is incredibly important to the DEP and the politics of this.
All right. Again, thank you all. Have a good night. Sit down and read your NJPACT real rules.